day 51. And this is the moment everything stops being theoretical. Everything stops being diplomatic theater and turns into something raw, unpredictable, and potentially catastrophic, because what happened in the Strait of Hormuz was not a warning, not a signal, not a maneuver designed to buy time. It was gunfire, direct and intentional against commercial vessels moving through one of the most critical arteries of the global economy. And it happened just hours after Iran told the world the passage was open, safe, and ready for transit, which means this was not confusion, not miscommunication, but a calculated contradiction designed to send a chilling message. Nothing moves unless Iran allows it. And even when Iran says it allows it, that permission can vanish in seconds, replaced by force, by chaos, by fear. And the implications of that message ripple far beyond 3 ships, far beyond a single morning, because this is about control, about dominance over a choke point that carries a massive portion of the world's energy supply. And when that choke point becomes unpredictable, the entire system begins to tremble. Markets react, governments react, militaries shift posture, and suddenly what looked like a tense standoff becomes something far more dangerous, something alive, something accelerating. Because here's what makes this moment different: the timing, the precision, and the response that followed, a response that did not come wrapped in diplomatic language or carefully measured tones, but instead arrived like a hammer, direct and unmistakable, as Donald Trump issued a statement that many analysts are now calling one of the most aggressive public ultimatums ever directed at Iran by a U.S. president, a statement that didn't just warn, didn't just condemn, but outlined consequences so sweeping, so total, that it forced the world to stop and ask a simple question: are we watching the final steps before a major conflict? Because when a leader publicly talks about eliminating every power plant and every bridge in a country, that is not routine pressure, that is not symbolic rhetoric, that is escalation at the highest level. And it lands in a moment where every variable is already under strain, where the IRGC is not operating from strength, but from pressure, from a tightening economic vice that is draining hundreds of millions of dollars from Iran's economy every single day. And that pressure changes behavior. It makes decisions sharper, riskier, more aggressive, because when options shrink, actors don't retreat. They push harder. They gamble. And that is exactly what this looks like. A gamble played out on open water in front of the entire world, with fast boats and heavy weapons, with no warnings issued, no attempts to de-escalate, just action, immediate and undeniable. And what's even more unsettling is how deliberate it appears, because these ships were not hiding, not provoking. They were moving in response to Iran's own signal that the strait was open, which transforms the entire incident into something far more strategic, almost psychological, a demonstration that rules can be rewritten in real time, that assurances mean nothing without enforcement. And that enforcement now sits firmly in the hands of a force willing to use unpredictability as a weapon. And that matters, because unpredictability is one of the most powerful tools in asymmetric conflict. It forces stronger opponents to hesitate, to question, to slow mail. And in a place like the Strait of Hormuz, hesitation alone can disrupt billions of dollars in trade, can shift shipping routes, can spike energy prices, can trigger cascading consequences across continents. And yet, while this is unfolding, while ships are turning around and crews are reporting incoming fire, something else is happening at the same time, something that adds another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. Diplomatic talks are being prepared, representatives are traveling, negotiations are scheduled, meaning we are watching 2 tracks run simultaneously: pressure and diplomacy, force and conversation. And that combination is not accidental. It is a classic structure of high stakes geopolitical strategy where one side increases pressure to strengthen its position at the negotiating table, and the other side must decide whether to interpret that pressure as leverage or as provocation, and that interpretation can determine whether talks move forward or collapse before they even begin. Because if one side believes the other has already crossed the line, then the entire framework of negotiation changes. It becomes less about compromise and more about response. And that is where this situation becomes incredibly fragile, because the line between tactic and mistake is razor thin, and once crossed, it is very difficult to step back, especially when public statements have already raised expectations, when ultimatums have been issued, when the world is watching. And that brings us back to the economic dimension of this crisis, the part that often moves quietly in the background, but in reality drives much of the decision making, because the numbers involved here are staggering. Losses measured not in millions, but in hundreds of millions per day, a sustained drain that over time can reshape an entire national economy, can strain internal systems, can create pressure not just at the top, but throughout society. And that kind of pressure has a way of surfacing in unpredictable ways, influencing decisions that might otherwise seem too risky, too extreme. And when you combine that economic strain with military capability, with strategic geography, with political messaging, you get a situation where every action carries multiple meanings, where a single incident at sea can be both a tactical move and a strategic signal, both a show of force and a test of boundaries. And the responses to that action then become signals themselves, creating a chain reaction of interpretation and counter-interpretation that can escalate rapidly if not carefully managed. And yet careful management becomes harder as rhetoric intensifies, as statements become more absolute, more final, because absolute statements leave little room for flexibility, little room for quiet adjustments. And that is why the language used in moments like this matters so much, because it shapes expectations, it defines perceived options, and it can lock decision makers into paths that become increasingly difficult to alter without appearing to back down. And in high stakes environments, perception is often as important as reality, because leaders are not only responding to events, they are responding to how those events are seen by allies, by adversaries, by domestic audiences. And that creates a complex web of incentives and constraints that can push situations toward escalation, even when no side explicitly seeks it. And this is where the next 72 hours become so critical, not because something specific is guaranteed to happen, but because the conditions are set for multiple possible outcomes, some leading toward de-escalation, others toward confrontation. And the difference between those paths may come down to decisions made in real time, under pressure, with incomplete information. And that uncertainty is what makes this moment so intense, because we are not looking at a static situation. We are looking at something in motion, something evolving, something that could shift direction very quickly, depending on how key actors interpret and respond to each other's moves. And that includes not just the primary players, but also others who may be involved indirectly, providing information, shaping perceptions, influencing decisions behind the scenes. Because modern conflicts are rarely isolated. They are interconnected, layered, influenced by multiple sources of input. And that complexity makes them harder to predict, harder to control, and ultimately more dangerous when they reach points of high tension like this. And so as the world watches, as analysts dissect statements, as markets react, as ships wait or reroute, The central question remains unresolved. Is this a demonstration meant to strengthen a negotiating position, or is it the beginning of a larger escalation that will be difficult to contain? Because the answer to that question will determine not just the next move, but the trajectory of the entire situation. And right now, with gunfire already exchanged, with ultimatums already issued, with pressure already mounting, the trajectory feels more uncertain than ever, balanced on a knife's edge between diplomacy and conflict, between calculation and miscalculation, between control and chaos. And in moments like this, history shows that outcomes are often decided not by long-term plans, but by immediate reactions, by how quickly and how carefully each side responds to what just happened. And that is why all eyes are now fixed on what comes next, not what was said yesterday, not what was planned last week, but what will be done in the hours ahead. Because in a situation moving this fast, the future is not something distant. It is something unfolding in real time, one decision at a time. And now the crisis deepens into something far more volatile and unpredictable, because once gunfire has already shattered the illusion of control, once commercial vessels have been directly targeted inside the Strait of Hormuz, the situation no longer lives in the realm of warnings or symbolic gestures. It becomes a test of interpretation under extreme pressure, where every move is dissected, every signal is amplified, and every response carries the weight of what might come next. Because in a moment like this, perception is not just important, it is everything. It shapes decisions, it defines red lines, and it determines whether escalation slows down or accelerates out of control. And what makes this moment especially dangerous is that each side is now interpreting events through its own strategic lens, its own assumptions, its own internal pressures, and those interpretations do not always align, meaning one action can be seen as calculated leverage by one side and outright provocation by the other. And that gap in perception is where crises tend to spiral, because responses are not based on what actually happened, but on what leaders believe happened and what they believe must be done to maintain credibility, strength, and control. And credibility in a high-stakes geopolitical confrontation is not a soft concept. It is a hard constraint. It limits flexibility. It narrows options, and it pushes decision makers toward actions that reinforce their stated positions, even when those actions increase risk. And that is exactly the dynamic now taking hold, because what the IRGC demonstrated was not just the ability to fire on ships, but the willingness to inject uncertainty into a system that depends entirely on predictability. And that kind of uncertainty spreads quickly because global shipping does not operate on courage. It operates on risk calculation, and when risk becomes unpredictable, when safe passage can turn into incoming fire without warning, the entire system begins to hesitate. Routes are reconsidered, delays multiply, insurance premiums surge, and the economic ripple effects begin almost immediately. And those effects extend far beyond the region, because the strait is not just a narrow stretch of water, it is a central artery of global energy flow. And when that artery is disrupted, even briefly, the shock waves move across continents, influencing markets, shaping policy discussions, and forcing governments to reassess their positions. And that is precisely why this kind of action is so strategically significant, because it achieves impact without requiring sustained engagement. It leverages uncertainty itself as a force multiplier. And yet that same strategy carries enormous risk, because it depends on staying just below a threshold that may no longer be stable, especially after the response that followed. because when Donald Trump issued his ultimatum, the tone of the entire situation shifted, not gradually, but instantly, because the language used was not open-ended, not flexible. It was direct, absolute, and tied to specific consequences that would fundamentally alter the landscape if carried out, targeting infrastructure at a scale that signals not just retaliation, but systemic disruption. And when statements like that are made publicly, they do more than communicate intent. They create expectations. They establish a framework that both sides must now navigate. And that framework is inherently rigid because once a line is drawn so clearly, stepping back from it becomes difficult without appearing to concede ground. And that creates pressure on both sides simultaneously. Pressure on Iran to decide whether to push further or adjust course, and pressure on the United States to align its actions with its words, because any gap between the two will be closely watched, analyzed, and interpreted as a signal in itself. And that mutual pressure creates a feedback loop, a dynamic where each side's decisions are influenced by how they expect the other side to respond. And that loop can either stabilize into cautious negotiation or escalate into rapid confrontation, depending on how it is managed in the coming hours. And those hours matter more than ever now because diplomatic talks are approaching with representatives heading toward Islamabad. And those talks are no longer taking place in a neutral environment. They are happening in the shadow of gunfire and ultimatums, which means the stakes are higher. The margin for error is smaller, and the challenge of finding common ground is significantly greater, because both sides must now decide whether to treat the recent escalation as part of the negotiation process or as a breakdown of it. And that distinction is critical, because if it is seen as leverage, talks may proceed with tension but with purpose. But if it is seen as a violation, as a step too far, then the entire diplomatic track could collapse before it even begins. And that is the fragile balance at the heart of this moment, a balance between pressure and dialogue, between force and restraint. And maintaining that balance requires a level of coordination, communication, and restraint that becomes harder to sustain as rhetoric intensifies and actions become more aggressive. And that is exactly what we are seeing now, an environment where both sides are signaling strength while still keeping the door to negotiation open. And that dual approach, often described as coercive diplomacy, can be effective, but it is also inherently unstable, because it depends on both sides interpreting signals in a compatible way. And if that alignment breaks down, the same actions intended to create leverage can instead trigger escalation. And this is where additional layers of complexity come into play, including the role of intelligence, information flow, and external influences. Because in modern conflicts, decisions are rarely made based on a single source of information. They are informed by a network of inputs, some visible, some not. And those inputs shape perception, confidence, and risk tolerance. And when confidence increases, when actors believe they have better awareness, better positioning, better insight into the other side's capabilities, they may be more willing to take bold actions, to push boundaries, to test limits. And while that can create short-term advantages, it also increases the likelihood of crossing thresholds that trigger strong responses. And in a highly monitored environment like this, where military assets are actively tracking movements, where surveillance systems provide near real-time awareness, the space for ambiguity is reduced. Actions are seen, recorded, and analyzed almost instantly, which means responses can come faster with greater precision and potentially with greater impact. And that speed compresses decision-making timelines, leaving less room for deliberation, less room for de-escalation, and more pressure to act quickly in order to maintain initiative. And that is why the next phase of this crisis is so unpredictable, because it is shaped by a convergence of factors that are all intensifying at once: military readiness, economic pressure, political messaging, diplomatic timing, and the simple reality that once escalation reaches a certain point, it becomes increasingly difficult to reverse without significant concessions. And concessions in this context are not just policy decisions, they are statements about power, about influence, about who sets the terms and who responds to them. And that is why they are so hard to make, because they carry long-term implications that extend far beyond the immediate crisis. And so each side must weigh not only the short-term benefits of any decision, but also the long-term costs, how it will affect their position in future negotiations, how it will be perceived by allies and adversaries, how it will shape the broader strategic environment. And those calculations are being made right now in real time, under conditions of uncertainty and pressure. And that is what makes this moment so critical, because the situation is still fluid, still evolving, still open to multiple outcomes. But those outcomes are beginning to narrow, shaped by the accumulation of actions and reactions that are unfolding hour by hour. And as that narrowing continues, the importance of each decision increases, because there is less room to adjust, less room to recalibrate, and more at stake with every move. And that is the defining characteristic of this phase: a transition from shock to sustained tension, from isolated incident to unfolding crisis, where the next steps will not just respond to what has already happened, but will determine the direction of everything that follows. And right now, that direction remains uncertain, balanced between escalation and restraint, between confrontation and negotiation. And the path that ultimately emerges will depend on choices that are being made in this exact moment behind closed doors, informed by incomplete information, shaped by competing priorities, and driven by the urgent need to act without triggering something even larger. Because in a crisis like this, the greatest challenge is not just responding effectively, it is responding in a way that does not make the situation even harder to control. And that is the challenge now facing everyone involved as the world watches and waits for what comes next.